The kindergarten classroom buzzed with its usual morning chaos. Tiny hands painted colorful masterpieces at one table, while others stacked blocks into precarious towers that toppled with gleeful shrieks. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting golden squares on the carpeted floor. To an outsider, it was a scene brimming with innocence and joy. But for Miss Harper, today would be anything but ordinary. Miss Harper had been teaching for nearly a decade, her gentle demeanor and endless patience earning her the nickname Mom among her students. She moved between the tables, offering encouragement and wiping sticky fingers with practiced ease. Yet, despite the cheerful atmosphere, she couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled in her chest since arriving at school that morning. A faint prickling sensation, like being watched. It wasn't until mid-morning circle time that the unease reached its peak. The children sat cross-legged on the rug, their eyes wide as Miss Harper read aloud from a picture book about adventurous animals. Everything seemed normal, until Emily, one of her quieter students, suddenly stood up and walked toward her. Emily was a shy girl, often content to sit in the corner during playtime, her dark curls framing a face that rarely smiled. Today, however, something was different. Her movements were deliberate, almost urgent, as she approached Miss Harper. The other children barely noticed, distracted by the illustrations in the book, but Miss Harper felt her pulse quicken as Emily tugged gently on her sleeve. "Miss Harper," Emily whispered, her voice trembling so softly that only someone leaning close could hear. "He's here." Miss Harper froze, her hand hovering over the page of the book. For a moment, the room seemed to blur. The laughter of the children faded into a distant hum, and the warmth of the sunlight turned icy against her skin. "What did you say, sweetheart?" she asked, forcing a calmness into her tone that she didn't feel. Emily looked up at her, her big brown eyes filled with a mixture of fear and certainty. "He's here," she repeated, this time louder but still hushed. Then, after a pause, she added 3 more words that sent chills racing down Miss Harper's spine. "And he knows." The teacher's breath hitched, her face draining of color. She stared at Emily, searching for some sign that this was a game, a misunderstanding, or even a fragment of a child's overactive imagination. But there was no playful glint in Emily's eyes, no hint of mischief, only dread. "Who's here, Emily?" Miss Harper managed to ask, her voice barely above a whisper. Before Emily could respond, the classroom door creaked open. Everyone turned to look, including Miss Harper, whose heart pounded wildly in her chest. Standing in the doorway was Mr. Grayson, the school janitor. He held a mop bucket in one hand and offered a sheepish smile when he noticed all the eyes on him. "Sorry to interrupt," he said gruffly, stepping inside. "Just here to clean up the spill in the hallway." Relief washed over Miss Harper, though it was short-lived. As Mr. Grayson moved past the group, Emily's grip on her sleeve tightened. "Not him," Emily murmured urgently, shaking her head. "The other one." Miss Harper blinked, confusion swirling in her mind. "What do you mean, the other one?" she pressed, keeping her voice low. But Emily didn't answer. Instead, she glanced toward the far corner of the room, where a shadow stretched unnaturally long across the wall despite the bright sunlight streaming through the windows. It wasn't cast by anyone visible. It simply existed, shifting slightly as if alive. The sight made Miss Harper's stomach churn. She forced herself to stand, plastering a reassuring smile on her face for the benefit of the class. "All right, everyone," she announced brightly, clapping her hands. "Let's finish our story later. How about we go outside for recess early?" The children cheered, scrambling to their feet and grabbing jackets before filing out of the room. Emily lingered behind, clutching Miss Harper's hand tightly. Once the last child had left, the teacher knelt down to Emily's level, her expression serious. "Emily, I need you to tell me what's going on," she said firmly yet gently. "Who is he? And what does he know?" Emily hesitated, biting her lower lip. Finally, she whispered, "I saw him last night, in my dream. He told me to come here." Miss Harper's throat tightened. Dreams weren't uncommon topics among young children, but there was something unsettlingly vivid about the way Emily spoke, as if the dream hadn't been a product of her imagination but a memory of something real. "Did he say why?" Miss Harper asked, dreading the answer. Emily nodded slowly. "He said you'd understand. That you'd remember." "Remember what?" Miss Harper prompted, her voice cracking slightly. But Emily didn't elaborate. Instead, she pointed toward the corner where the shadow had been moments earlier. When Miss Harper followed her gaze, the shadow was gone. In its place stood a single object that hadn't been there before. A small wooden box, intricately carved with symbols that seemed ancient and unfamiliar. Miss Harper stared at it, her mind reeling. Where had it come from? And why did looking at it make her chest ache? As though some long-buried memory was clawing its way to the surface. Before she could react further, Emily tugged on her hand again. "We have to hide it," the little girl said urgently. "Before he comes back." Miss Harper hesitated. Her eyes locked on the small wooden box sitting innocuously in the corner of the room. Its intricate carvings seemed to shift subtly under the light, as if alive, and the symbols etched into its surface were unlike anything she'd ever seen. They weren't random designs, they formed patterns that felt deliberate, almost like a language. But what chilled her most was the sense of familiarity that washed over her. Somewhere, buried deep within her memory, she knew she had seen these symbols before. "Emily," Miss Harper whispered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to stay calm. "Where did this come from? Did you bring it here?" Emily shook her head vehemently, her curls bouncing with the motion. "No, it just appeared," she said, her voice barely audible. "After I told you about him." Miss Harper swallowed hard, her mind racing. This wasn't normal, not even remotely close to the kinds of things she dealt with as a kindergarten teacher. Yet, there was no denying the reality of the situation. The box was real, Emily's fear was real, and whatever or whoever was behind all of this was clearly connected to both of them. "We need to tell someone," Miss Harper murmured, more to herself than to Emily. "The principal, maybe, or the police." "No," Emily interrupted sharply, startling Miss Harper with the intensity in her voice. "You can't tell anyone. He'll know. And then?" She trailed off, her face pale and stricken. "And then what?" Miss Harper pressed gently, placing a reassuring hand on Emily's shoulder. Emily hesitated, tears welling up in her eyes. "And then he'll hurt you," she whispered finally, her voice breaking. "Like he hurt me." The words hit Miss Harper like a punch to the gut. Hurt her? What did that mean? Before she could ask, Emily pulled away and walked toward the box, her tiny frame dwarfed by its ominous presence. For a moment, she stood frozen, staring at it as though debating whether to touch it. Then, with surprising resolve, she reached out and picked it up, cradling it in her arms like a fragile treasure. "What are you doing?" Miss Harper asked, alarmed. "You shouldn't touch that. It might be dangerous." "It's already dangerous," Emily replied cryptically, turning back to face her teacher. "But we can't leave it here. If we do, he'll find it. And when he does—" She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Miss Harper wanted to argue, to insist they get rid of the box immediately or call for help. But something stopped her, a gut feeling that Emily was right. Whoever he wasn't someone they could trust. And if leaving the box behind meant putting themselves, and possibly others, at risk, then taking it with them seemed like the lesser of two evils. "All right," Miss Harper said finally, her voice firm despite the unease bubbling inside her. "We'll take it. But we're not keeping it here. We'll figure out what to do next once we're somewhere safe." Emily nodded, clutching the box tightly as Miss Harper led her out of the classroom. The hallway was eerily quiet, the usual hum of activity replaced by an unnatural stillness. Even the distant laughter of children playing outside sounded muffled, as though coming from another world entirely. As they passed the open door of the supply closet, Miss Harper caught a glimpse of Mr. Grayson, the janitor, leaning against his mop bucket. His back was turned to them, but something about his posture, the rigid way he stood unmoving, made her pause. "Come on," she urged softly, pulling Emily closer as they hurried past. Whether it was paranoia or instinct, She couldn't shake the feeling that his presence wasn't coincidental. Had he been watching them? Waiting? They reached Miss Harper's car without incident, though every step felt heavier than the last. Once inside, Miss Harper locked the doors and started the engine, glancing nervously at Emily in the passenger seat. The little girl sat stiffly, the box resting on her lap as though it weighed far more than its size suggested. Neither of them spoke as they drove away from the school, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. It wasn't until they were several miles down the road that Emily broke the silence. "Do you remember now?" she asked quietly, her gaze fixed on the box. "Remember what?" Miss Harper replied, gripping the steering wheel tighter. "The dreams," Emily said simply. "You used to have them too, didn't you?" "About him." Miss Harper's breath hitched. Dreams. That word again. She opened her mouth to deny it, to tell Emily she didn't know what she was talking about, but the lie stuck in her throat, because deep down she did remember. Fragments of nightmares long forgotten began surfacing in her mind. Shadowy figures looming over her bed, whispers echoing in languages she couldn't understand, and always, the same cold, unyielding presence watching her from the darkness. I don't know what you're talking about," Miss Harper stammered, her voice faltering. But Emily didn't respond. Instead, she leaned forward slightly, tilting the box so that its carvings caught the sunlight streaming through the windshield. One of the symbols glowed faintly, pulsing like a heartbeat. Miss Harper slammed on the brakes, her heart pounding wildly as the car skidded to a stop on the side of the road. "What is that thing?" she demanded, her voice rising in panic. "What's happening?" Emily looked at her, her expression eerily calm. "It's a key," she said matter-of-factly, "to where he comes from." "A key," Miss Harper repeated, her mind reeling. "To where? What are you talking about?" Before Emily could answer, the box emitted a low hum, growing louder with each passing second. The car filled with a blinding light, forcing Miss Harper to shield her eyes. When the brightness finally faded, she blinked rapidly, trying to regain her bearings. But what she saw made her blood run cold. Outside the car, the world had changed. The familiar suburban streets were gone, replaced by an endless expanse of gray mist. Shadows moved within the fog, their shapes distorted and unnatural. And standing directly in front of the car was a figure cloaked in black, his face obscured except for two glowing red eyes that burned with malevolent intent. "He found us," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "Now it's too late." The figure in black stood motionless, his glowing red eyes piercing through the fog like embers in the dark. Miss Harper's breath hitched as she stared at him, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. This wasn't real, it couldn't be real. And yet, there he was, just feet away from them, exuding an aura of menace so palpable it felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest. Who are you?" Miss Harper stammered, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound brave. The figure didn't respond. Instead, he raised one gloved hand and pointed directly at Emily, or rather at the box cradled in her lap. The hum emanating from the wooden object grew louder, vibrating through the car like an electric current. Emily clutched the box tighter, her knuckles white. "Don't let him take it," she whispered urgently, her voice barely audible over the noise. "If he gets it, everything will end." Miss Harper's heart raced as she glanced between Emily and the figure outside. "What do you mean, everything will end?" she demanded, her panic giving way to frustration. "What is this thing? What does he want?" Emily hesitated, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's not just a key," she admitted finally. "It's a prison. For him." She gestured toward the cloaked figure, whose presence seemed to grow more oppressive with each passing second. "He's been trapped inside it for years, but now he's breaking free. That's why he came to me. In my dreams, he told me where to find it. He said if I brought it to you, he could escape." Miss Harper's stomach churned as the pieces began falling into place. The symbols on the box, the strange familiarity she'd felt when looking at them, the nightmares she thought she'd forgotten. All of it pointed to one horrifying truth. She was connected to this somehow. Whether by choice or circumstance, her past was tied to the entity standing before them. "But why me?" Miss Harper asked, her voice cracking. "Why would he come after me?" Emily shook her head, her expression filled with guilt and fear. "Because you helped put him there," she said softly. "You don't remember, but you were part of it. A long time ago." The revelation hit Miss Harper like a freight train. Memories flooded back in disjointed flashes. Faces she couldn't recognize, voices chanting in unison, and a ritual conducted under a blood-red moon. She had been younger then, barely out of college, drawn into something she hadn't fully understood. Something dangerous. Whatever they had done, it had cost her dearly. She had buried those memories deep, convincing herself they were nothing more than bad dreams. But now, staring at the figure in black, she knew the truth. She had helped imprison him, and now he wanted revenge. "We need to run," Miss Harper said suddenly, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "We can't stay here." "No!" Emily cried, grabbing her arm. "If we leave the box, he'll follow us. He'll never stop until he has it. We have to finish this." "Finish what?" Miss Harper snapped, her voice rising in desperation. "How do we fight something like that? Look at him. He's not even human." Emily didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. "This is why he chose me," she said, handing it to Miss Harper. "I found it last week, hidden in my backpack. I think it's instructions." Miss Harper unfolded the paper with shaking hands. Written in neat, precise handwriting were several lines of text, detailing a ritual meant to reinforce the seal on the box. The language was archaic, almost poetic, but the meaning was clear. They needed to perform the ritual in a specific location, a place called the Hollow Veil. According to the note, it was a convergence point where the boundaries between worlds were weakest. "Where is this place?" Miss Harper asked, scanning the note again. "Do you know where it is?" Emily nodded slowly. "I've seen it in my dreams. It's not far from here, but we have to hurry. He's getting stronger." As if on cue, the figure in black took a step closer to the car, his glowing eyes narrowing menacingly. The ground beneath them began to tremble, and the fog thickened, swirling around the vehicle like a living thing. Miss Harper knew they were running out of time. "All right," she said firmly, steeling herself. "Tell me how to get there." Emily gave her directions, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around them. Miss Harper started the engine and sped off, leaving the figure behind, at least for now. As they drove, the landscape shifted subtly, becoming darker and more desolate. Trees twisted into grotesque shapes lined the road, their branches clawing at the sky. The air grew colder, and the hum of the box intensified, as though urging them onward. When they finally arrived at the designated spot, Miss Harper realized it was an abandoned cemetery, its headstones cracked and overgrown with weeds. At the center of the graveyard stood a crumbling stone altar, surrounded by symbols carved into the earth. Emily climbed out of the car without hesitation, clutching the box tightly as she made her way toward the altar. Miss Harper followed, her legs feeling like lead. "This is it," Emily said, placing the box on the altar. "We need to say the words together. Otherwise, it won't work." Miss Harper nodded, her throat dry as sandpaper. "What are the words?" Emily recited them first, her voice soft but steady. Miss Harper repeated after her, the unfamiliar syllables rolling off her tongue like a prayer. As they spoke, the symbols on the ground began to glow, casting an eerie light across the cemetery. The air crackled with energy, and the hum from the box reached a deafening crescendo. Suddenly, the ground split open with a deafening roar, and a vortex of shadow and flame erupted around them. The figure in black emerged from the chaos, his form shifting and writhing like smoke. His scream was unearthly, a sound that rattled Miss Harper's bones and threatened to shatter her resolve. "You cannot contain me," he roared, lunging toward them. But before he could reach the altar, the glowing symbols flared brighter, forming a barrier that repelled him. With one final, desperate cry, he was sucked back into the vortex, which collapsed in on itself moments later, leaving only silence in its wake. For a long moment, neither Miss Harper nor Emily moved. Then, slowly, Emily picked up the box, which was now silent and inert. "It's over," she whispered, her voice tinged with both relief and sorrow. But as they turned to leave, Miss Harper couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching them. Somewhere, deep within the shadows, a pair of glowing red eyes blinked once, and then vanished. The drive back to town was eerily quiet. The storm that had raged within the cemetery had vanished without a trace, replaced by an unnatural calm. Miss Harper gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles white as she navigated the winding roads. Beside her, Emily sat silently, clutching the now dormant wooden box in her lap. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. The ritual had worked, or so it seemed, but the weight of what they'd done hung heavy between them, unspoken yet undeniable. When they finally reached Emily's house, Miss Harper hesitated before turning off the engine. She glanced at the little girl, who looked smaller and more fragile than ever in the dim light of the dashboard. "Are you going to be okay?" she asked softly, her voice breaking the silence like a fragile thread. Emily nodded, though her eyes betrayed a mixture of exhaustion and unease. "I think so," she murmured. "But I don't think he's really gone." Miss Harper felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" Emily didn't answer immediately. Instead, she opened the car door and stepped out, holding the box close to her chest. Before closing the door, she leaned back inside and looked directly at Miss Harper. "He's still here," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Not fully, but he's waiting. For us." Before Miss Harper could respond, Emily turned and walked toward her house, disappearing into the shadows of the porch. Miss Harper watched her go, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to follow, to insist on staying with Emily until she was sure the girl was safe. But something stopped her. It wasn't just fear or exhaustion. It was the sinking realization that Emily was right. Whatever they had done, it wasn't over. Not completely. As she drove away, Miss Harper couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every shadow along the road seemed to stretch longer than it should. Every flicker of movement in her peripheral vision made her grip the wheel tighter. By the time she arrived home, her nerves were frayed, and her mind raced with unanswered questions. What had they truly unleashed? And what price would they pay for containing it? Inside her apartment, Miss Harper locked the doors and drew the curtains, trying to create a barrier against the outside world. But no matter how many precautions she took, the sense of unease lingered. She placed the keys on the kitchen counter and froze. There, sitting innocuously beside them, was a single sheet of paper. It hadn't been there when she left for work that morning. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. Written in the same precise handwriting as the ritual instructions were 3 chilling words. "Until next time." Miss Harper's breath caught in her throat. She spun around, scanning the room for any sign of intrusion, but everything appeared normal. Still, the message was clear. This wasn't the end. Whatever force they had confronted in the cemetery, it wasn't defeated. It was merely biding its time. Over the following weeks, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. Miss Harper resumed teaching, forcing herself to smile through the chaos of her kindergarten class. Emily came to school as usual, though she rarely spoke and often stared out the window with a faraway look in her eyes. They never mentioned the events of that day, but their shared secret bound them together in ways neither could articulate. Yet, despite the outward appearance of routine, strange things began happening. Objects moved on their own in Miss Harper's apartment. Shadows shifted where no light source existed. And late at night, when the world was silent, she sometimes heard faint whispers drifting through the darkness. Whispers in a language she couldn't understand but somehow recognized. One evening, as she graded papers at her desk, Miss Harper noticed something odd about the mirror across the room. Her reflection stared back at her, but it wasn't quite right. Its eyes glowed faintly red, and its lips curled into a cruel smile. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the reflection returned to normal. Miss Harper blinked, unsure if she had imagined it, or if it was another warning. The next morning, She found a note tucked into her coat pocket. It was written in Emily's handwriting, though she hadn't seen the girl since school ended the previous day. The message was simple but haunting. Don't forget. He remembers. Miss Harper folded the note carefully and placed it in her desk drawer, alongside the original instructions for the ritual. She knew she couldn't ignore what was happening. Whatever they had fought and temporarily contained was still out there, waiting, watching, and deep down, she understood that one day, it would return. When it did, she and Emily would have to face it again. Together. For now, though, all they could do was wait. The end.